Hi, this is Dr. Kristen Rodier. I am the coordinator for Philosophy 252, an associate professor of philosophy at Athabasca University, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about Unit 6. So this is the overview. Your reading is Introduction to Fallacies and Bias, so that's Chapter 13 and Chapter 14 on Fallacies of Ambiguity. And then 2 chapters from Calling Bullshit. And what I want to just draw everyone's attention to off the hop is that the chapter 13 really introduces what a fallacy is and what a fallacy does, and the role of looking for and identifying and clarifying what a fallacy is in critical thinking. So when we say informal fallacy, really what we're saying is it's not given in the same kind of deductive, logical forms that we saw previously in the course. So a way of putting it is a fallacy in the strict sense is a form of argument that's invalid, right? It has true premises and it can have a false conclusion, or it violates a relevance condition. So we're going to get a lot into relevance conditions. Early on, we talked about cogency, which is where the premises are relevant and reasonable to the conclusion. Here, we're starting to look at the ways that relevance can go wrong. And so we have a definition of fallacies in the textbook. This is taken from Douglas Walton. There's a lot of ways to define fallacies because there are a lot of fallacies. And so when I give these 5 conditions, I want you to think of it as a rule of thumb that is helpful, but that's not everything. Every fallacy is all of the time. So a fallacy, and identifying a fallacy, you have something that is an argument or purports to be an argument. It falls short of some standard of correctness, whether that's relevant, whether that's dialectical acceptability, whether that's having a clear and good definition. All of these standards of correctness really need to be elaborated because it's not enough to point out a fallacy to just say that's a fallacy. We have to say what's the standard of correctness and how does it fall short. It's used in the context of a dialogue, so that often means that a fallacy, the way that we're going to unpack it, it takes place between 2 speakers. So the reason for that is it's often actually, what's fallacious about it is that it is attacking the person or appealing to their emotions or making some kind of mistake in the process of what should be respectful, back and forth and reasonable, either be it a line of inquisitive, questioning, or a dialogue, some kind of debate over the sufficiency of something. So it's often in the context of a dialogue. It has a semblance of correctness about it, right? It's not just I know you are, but what am I? It has a real pull in some kind of way, and maybe some of that pull is that people repeat it, right? That it's actually something that gets passed around. That's part of the pull on with a lot of bullshit. And it poses a serious problem to a realization of the goal of the dialogue. So there's something that the fallacy does that gets in the way of the very seeking of truth or better beliefs or whatever the point of our dialogue is usually. It poses a problem to that. So it either stops it, it derails it, it undermines it, it gets in the way of what we're trying to do. So these chapters from the Dayton-Rodier book have been paired with the discussions in Calling Bullshit on selection bias and data visualization, primarily because of the ways that we need to talk about how a study might work in order to understand how it might be visualized and how those visuals can be misleading. And so what brings all of this together is something called ambiguity. And ambiguity is when something has more than one meaning. So this it's great when it's art, when it's feeling, when it's drama. Ambiguity just doesn't help us when it comes to logic. We really need to stipulate definitions, and we need to be clear in order to test for sufficiency. So ambiguity can be when something is unclear. When we have multiple meanings, it allows us to derive multiple conclusions, which of course poses a problem for validity because we want there to be no case in which the premises are true and the conclusions false. But if we can derive a bunch of different things, then we're not able to understand what is the conclusion being drawn. And if we have ambiguity, it blocks transitivity. So getting that transitive middle term, it has to be the same in order for us to use it to create that ordering relationship. Otherwise, there's a break in the transitivity. So I'll just move myself over. When we create conditions of ambiguity, it's often because we are using words to represent the world. And so one of the ways that we can use words to represent the world in an ambiguous way is by actually concretizing something that's not concrete. So the fallacy of hypothesization treats an abstract or metaphorical thing as if it is definite and concrete. So this is where we talk about history on the march, or nature wants this kind of thing, or whatever, where basically we take something that is too broad or nebulous to actually be the kind of thing that we're talking about, where we attribute properties to it and try to explain away too many things with something that's abstract, but treating it as though it's a definite concrete thing. And so there's lots of examples and discussion of that in the textbook. Another form of fallacy that trades on an ambiguity is equivocation. So this is where we use one word in two ways, or we have two words that mean different things, but we talk about them as though they have one meaning. And so when we do that, again, it's blocking transitivity. And so we're really paying attention to the ways that within an argument, language can shift, or language can actually not shift, but it's treated as though it does. So paying attention to whether or not things are being used in the way they're being presented, and watching for those changes of language. Another form of ambiguity fallacy is around the question of the parts whole relationship. And I think it's really important to get this really clear before we start talking about generalizations, because composition and division, I think, are harder to spot. And if you spot them and you describe them, then it makes better sense what's wrong with them when you're pointing them out. So the composition and division have to do with the parts whole relationship. So we talked in the textbook a lot about a fallacy is committed when there's something called divisional or compositional heredity, but where there isn't that, but it's treated as though there is that. Okay, so for example, this piece of iron is light, right? It doesn't weigh very much. Therefore, this machine made entirely of iron parts must not be heavy, right? And so that's a property of a part. And the idea is that the whole inherits the property of the parts, right? And that's a fallacy in this case. And the division goes from properties of the whole to property of the parts. That's why I like these arrows. Composition, we're going from parts to whole. Division, we're going from whole to parts. And so basically we're saying a property like the Edmonton Oilers is a great hockey team. Therefore, every member on it is a great member or whatever. We're taking properties from the whole and dividing it. So here we're not dealing with rules and special cases, which is what's going on with generalizations in later units, but just pay attention to that part-whole relationship. Are we talking about a part? Are we talking about a whole? And are we saying that they have the same property? And then looking at the kind of thing that it is and noticing whether or not the kind of thing that it is would have compositional or divisional heredity. For example, all of these water molecules have the property of being H2O, therefore this glass of water has the property of H2O. That doesn't change whether it's a lot of water or a little bit of water, right? Another form of ambiguity is at the sentence level. So we have amphiboly as a form of ambiguity, and that's when there's a problem with the grammar. So you have a sentence that has more than one meaning, and with the fallacy of accent, there's not a straightforward problem with the grammar, but depending on how the sentence is said, the sentence means something different, right? There's so many different ways for one sentence to mean more things. So sometimes we have to add a lot of qualifications onto our sentences to get them really specific, because a person could say one thing, but with emphasis on something, it's actually an accusation. But then when you say, well, that's an accusation, they will say, no, look at the words that I use. There's no accusation there. But the emphasis changes the meaning. And so then also we can have ambiguity in how things are represented. And part of that is just that we're trying to represent things about the world, and every time we have a layer of representation or abstraction, we're going to lose some of that detail. Here, using visualizations to create meaning, the visual can be ambiguous. I would also sort of just use the word here like unclear or obscuring these visuals. So the glass slipper is the one where you try to take one kind of information and put it into a graph that's not appropriate. A duck is where it's just completely form over function. So maybe it's like in a weird shape or something. And also people can use visuals to be misleading. So looking at what are the numbers on the X and the Y axis, have they started at 0? Have they changed numbers over time? Have they binned the data? So multiple years in one bin, but then each year is separate on another part of the diagram, kind of like let's lump together all those bad years. So looking for how data is binned together. And then also non-proportional ink. So what I would say about that is you have this principle of good visuals, which is that you should represent things proportionally with ink in a consistent manner in relation to each other. But if you violate that, let's say 20% here and 40% here, but the 40 is triple the size of the 20, that's non-proportional ink. So anytime it violates that, you're using that to skew something. And so again, I really, really encourage you to do the practice exercises, go through the answers, and take a look at the glossary items, read through your readings, And yeah, and then take the quiz and get ready for your final project.